The fluorescent lights in the emergency room buzzed overhead as I clutched my chest, gasping for air, while my own son walked away from me without looking back. For 12 agonizing hours, I sat in that waiting room chair, watching strangers come and go, realizing that the person I had raised, sacrificed everything for, and loved unconditionally had abandoned me in my darkest hour. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this touches your heart, please subscribe because I have more incredible stories coming your way. My name is Ruby Murphy, and I'm 68 years old. I spent my entire life building a successful business empire and accumulating wealth that I plan to leave to my only son. But that night in the emergency room changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the price of unconditional love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of medical equipment filled my senses as I struggled to breathe in the crowded emergency room of St. Catherine's Medical Center. My chest felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and was slowly tightening them with each labored breath I took. The pain had started 3 hours ago during what should have been a peaceful evening at home, but now I found myself alone on a hard plastic chair, surrounded by strangers who were fighting their own battles against illness and injury. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, scrolling through the contact list until I found the number I knew by heart. Hunter Hall, my son, my only child, the person I had poured my entire life into raising after his father died when he was just 8 years old. Hunter was now 35, married, and living just 20 minutes away from my home in the affluent neighborhood of Brookside Heights. He had always been my priority, my reason for working 16-hour days to build Murphy Construction from a small local business into one of the most successful contracting companies in the tri-state area. When I called him that evening, my voice, barely above a whisper as I explained that I was having chest pains and needed someone to drive me to the hospital, his response had been immediate and reassuring. "Mom, don't worry about anything. Sarah and I will be there in 15 minutes. Just sit tight and try to stay calm." Sarah Chen was his wife of 6 years, a woman I had grown to love like the daughter I never had. She was practical, organized, and had always seemed genuinely caring whenever we spent time together during family gatherings. They had arrived exactly when promised, with Hunter helping me into their luxury sedan while Sarah gathered my purse, insurance cards, and the list of medications I kept organized in a small notebook. The kind of thoughtful details that had always made me appreciate her presence in our family. During the drive to the hospital, Sarah had called ahead to let the emergency room know we were coming, speaking in the confident, professional tone she used in her job as a marketing executive at a major pharmaceutical company. "Everything's going to be fine, Mom," Hunter had said, squeezing my hand as we pulled up to the emergency entrance. "St. Catherine's has the best cardiac unit in the state. Remember when Dad's business partner had his heart attack 5 years ago? They saved his life, and he's doing great now." His words were meant to be comforting, but I could hear the underlying tension in his voice that suggested he was more worried than he wanted to let on. The registration process had been efficient, with Sarah handling most of the paperwork while Hunter stayed by my side, helping me answer the triage nurse's questions about my symptoms and medical history. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, had taken my vital signs and assured us that chest pain was treated as a priority, but warned that it might be a 2 to 3 hour wait before I could be seen by a doctor due to several critical cases that had arrived earlier in the evening. We had settled into the waiting area, with Hunter on my left and Sarah on my right, both of them trying to distract me with conversation about work, the weather, and their recent vacation to the mountains. Sarah had brought a small bag with snacks and water, anticipating a long wait, and she periodically checked on my comfort level, adjusting the thin hospital blanket around my shoulders and asking if I needed anything from the vending machines. That's when Hunter's phone had started ringing. The first call came about an hour into our wait, and he had stepped away to answer it, speaking in hushed tones near the windows that overlooked the hospital parking lot. When he returned, his expression was troubled, and I could see that whatever conversation he had just finished had created some kind of conflict or stress that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay, honey?" I had asked, noting the way his jaw was clenched and how he was avoiding making direct eye contact with me. "Just work stuff, Mom. Nothing for you to worry about." But his answer felt rehearsed, like he had prepared what to say before sitting back down. Sarah had given him a questioning look, but he had shaken his head slightly, some kind of silent communication passing between them that I couldn't interpret. The second call had come 30 minutes later, and this time Hunter's conversation had been more animated, though still conducted in whispers that made it impossible for me to understand what was being discussed. When he returned to his seat, he had been visibly agitated, running his hands through his hair in the nervous gesture I remembered from his teenage years, whenever he was hiding something from me. "Mom," he had said, his voice carrying a note of urgency that immediately put me on alert. "I need to step out for a little while. There's an emergency at the construction site. The foundation pour for the Morrison project is having problems, and if we don't fix it tonight, we'll lose the entire contract." I had stared at him in disbelief, trying to process what he was telling me. The Morrison project was indeed important. A multi-million-dollar commercial development that represented the largest contract Murphy Construction had ever landed. But I was his mother, sitting in an emergency room with chest pains that could potentially be life-threatening, and he was talking about leaving me to deal with a work emergency. "Hunter, I'm scared," I had admitted, reaching for his hand. "Can't someone else handle the construction problem? I really need you here with me." He had looked genuinely torn, glancing between me and Sarah with an expression that suggested he was weighing competing priorities in his mind. "The problem is that I'm the only one authorized to make the decisions about structural changes, and the concrete crew is threatening to walk off the job if we don't resolve this tonight. If we lose this contract, Mom, it could seriously damage the company's reputation." Sarah had jumped in at that point, her voice taking on the same practical, problem-solving tone she used when organizing family events or managing complex situations. "Ruby, I can stay with you. Hunter can go handle the emergency, and I'll be here to advocate for you with the medical staff and make sure you get the care you need. By the time you're actually seen by a doctor, he'll probably be back." The logic had made sense on the surface. Sarah was competent and caring, familiar with medical terminology from her work in pharmaceuticals, and certainly capable of handling any questions or decisions that might arise during my treatment. Hunter would be able to resolve the work crisis that could potentially cost our family business hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I would still have someone I trusted by my side during what was already a stressful and frightening experience. "Are you sure you'll be okay, Mom?" Hunter had asked, but I could see that he was already mentally preparing to leave, already shifting his focus to the business emergency that was demanding his immediate attention. "I'll be fine," I had said, trying to project more confidence than I actually felt. "Sarah will take good care of me, and you need to protect the business. Just promise me you'll come back as soon as you can." He had kissed my forehead and squeezed my hand one more time before gathering his jacket and car keys. "I love you, Mom. Sarah will call me the minute you're taken back to see the doctor, and I'll be here before you know it." And then he was gone, disappearing through the automatic doors that led to the parking garage, leaving me alone with Sarah in a waiting room full of strangers who were dealing with their own medical emergencies and family crises. That had been 4 hours ago. 4 long, increasingly uncomfortable hours during which my chest pain had intensified, my anxiety had skyrocketed, and Sarah had received 2 phone calls that had resulted in hushed conversations and increasingly frequent glances at her watch. Now, as I sat in that hard plastic chair watching the digital clock on the wall tick past midnight, I was beginning to understand that something was very wrong with the story I had been told about Hunter's work emergency, and that the woman sitting beside me might not be the caring daughter-in-law I had believed her to be. My name is Ruby Murphy, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be sitting alone in an emergency room questioning everything. I thought I knew about my relationship with my only son. To understand how devastating this moment truly was, you need to understand the life I had built and the sacrifices I had made to ensure that Hunter would never want for anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was born Ruby Catherine Barnes in the small farming town of Cedar Falls, the daughter of a dairy farmer who worked 18-hour days just to keep our family fed and housed. My mother, Daisy Barnes, had died when I was only 14, leaving me to help raise my 3 younger siblings while finishing high school and dreaming of a life beyond the endless cycle of farm chores and financial struggle that defined our existence. I learned early that survival required determination, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to the people you love. When I was 19, I met Thomas Murphy at a county fair. He was 22, tall and handsome with calloused hands that spoke of honest labor and bright eyes that seemed to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Thomas worked for a small construction company in the city of Willowbrook, about 40 miles from Cedar Falls, and he had dreams of starting his own business someday. We fell in love quickly and completely, marrying just 8 months after we met in a simple ceremony at the local Methodist church. Those early years of marriage were challenging but filled with hope. Thomas and I moved to Willowbrook, where I found work as a secretary at the courthouse while he continued learning the construction trade and saving every penny he could toward his dream of independence. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery on Main Street, and I still remember how the smell of fresh bread would wake us up each morning, making even our modest circumstances feel somehow blessed. Hunter was born when I was 26, after 3 years of trying to conceive and beginning to worry that parenthood might not be in our future. The moment I held him in my arms, looking into those perfect little eyes that were exactly the same shade of blue as his father's, I knew that everything in my life had changed. This tiny person would be my priority, my purpose, my legacy. Thomas felt the same overwhelming love and responsibility, and we made a pact that night in the hospital that our son would have every opportunity we had never been given. When Hunter was 8 years old, our carefully planned future was shattered by a phone call that came at 2 a.m. Thomas had been working late, overseeing the foundation pour for a new office building, when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into his truck at 60 miles per hour. He died instantly, they told me at the hospital, though I barely heard the words through the roar of grief and disbelief that filled my head. Suddenly, I was a 28-year-old widow with an 8-year-old son, a mortgage I couldn't afford on my secretary's salary, and no clear path forward. The small construction company Thomas had been working for offered me a modest settlement and their condolences, but it was nowhere near enough to maintain the life we had been building together. I had 2 choices: move back to Cedar Falls and raise Hunter in the same cycle of financial struggle I had grown up in, or find a way to build something better from the ashes of our destroyed dreams. I chose to fight. Using the settlement money as a down payment, I purchased Thomas's tools and equipment from his former employer and officially started Murphy Construction 3 months after his funeral. I had no formal training in construction, no business experience, and no connections in an industry dominated by men who weren't particularly interested in taking orders from a grieving widow. But I had something they couldn't quantify: absolute determination to provide for my son. The first 5 years were brutal. I worked during the day learning every aspect of the construction business, from reading blueprints to managing subcontractors, to bidding on projects. In the evenings, I took business classes at the community college, studying accounting and project management, while Hunter did his homework at the kitchen table beside me. Weekends were spent on job sites, with Hunter playing quietly nearby while I supervised work and quality control. There were nights when I collapsed into bed so exhausted I could barely remember my own name, and mornings when I wasn't sure how I would find the energy to get up and do it all again. But every time I looked at Hunter, Every time I saw his face light up when I helped him with a school project or attended one of his baseball games, I remembered why I was fighting so hard to build something lasting. By the time Hunter graduated from high school, Murphy Construction had grown from a one-woman operation working out of our garage to a respected company with 12 full-time employees and contracts throughout the tri-state area. We had moved from our small starter home to a beautiful colonial in Brookside Heights, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Willowbrook. Hunter had attended private schools, taken piano lessons and tennis lessons, participated in every sport and activity that interested him, and never once had to worry about whether we could afford something he needed or wanted. I was proud of what we had accomplished together, but more importantly, I was proud of the young man Hunter had become. He was intelligent, charismatic, and seemed to genuinely care about other people's welfare. He had graduated from college with a degree in business administration and immediately joined Murphy Construction, working his way up from entry-level positions to project manager to vice president. He had married Sarah Chen, a lovely woman who seemed to appreciate both his ambition and his family values. By the time Hunter turned 30, I had begun transitioning more responsibilities to him, planning for eventual retirement and the satisfaction of knowing that the company I had built from nothing would continue to thrive under his leadership. Murphy Construction was now worth approximately $4 million, and I had accumulated significant personal wealth through careful investments and real estate acquisitions. My life insurance policy alone was worth $1.2 million, with Hunter listed as the sole beneficiary. I had always assumed that the sacrifices I had made, the 18-hour days and sleepless nights and constant stress of building a business, while raising a child alone, had created an unbreakable bond between us. Hunter had been my partner in this journey from the time he was old enough to understand what I was trying to accomplish. He had seen me struggle and fight and refuse to give up when everything seemed impossible. He had benefited from every success and shared in every milestone. But sitting in that emergency room chair, watching the clock move past 1 a.m. while my chest pain intensified and my son remained conspicuously absent, I was beginning to wonder if I had been naive about the depth of Hunter's gratitude and loyalty. The work emergency that had seemed so urgent 4 hours ago was starting to feel like an excuse, and Sarah's increasingly frequent phone calls and nervous glances were raising questions I didn't want to acknowledge. I had built an empire for my son, sacrificed my own comfort and security to ensure his success, and trusted him with both my business and my personal welfare. The idea that he might prioritize anything over my health and safety seemed impossible, but the evidence was mounting that I might have seriously misjudged the character of the person I had devoted my entire adult life to protecting and providing for. The woman I had trusted to stay by my side during this medical crisis was becoming more agitated with each passing hour, and I was starting to suspect that her loyalty might be more complicated than I had assumed. As the pain in my chest grew stronger and my anxiety reached levels that were probably affecting my blood pressure, I found myself confronting the possibility that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined possible. The evening had started like so many others in my comfortable routine at the Brookside Heights home that Thomas and I had dreamed of owning during those early years of marriage. I had spent the afternoon reviewing quarterly financial reports for Murphy Construction, pleased to see that our latest commercial projects were coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. Hunter had been doing excellent work as vice president, and I was increasingly confident that my decision to gradually transition leadership to him was proving successful. Around 6 o'clock, I had prepared a simple dinner of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, eating alone at the kitchen island while catching up on the local news. The house felt larger and quieter than usual, as it often did during the weekday evenings when Hunter was busy with his own family responsibilities, and I found myself missing the constant activity and conversation that had filled our home during his teenage years. After dinner, I had settled into my favorite armchair in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea and the latest novel from my book club. The evening sun was filtering through the large windows that overlooked my carefully maintained garden, casting a golden glow across the hardwood floors that Thomas had installed himself during our first year in this house. Everything felt peaceful and familiar, the comfortable routine of a woman who had worked hard for decades and was finally able to enjoy the fruits of her labor. At approximately 8:30 p.m., I had been reaching for my bookmark when the first wave of discomfort hit me. It started as a strange tightness in my chest, different from anything I had experienced before. At first, I dismissed it as indigestion from dinner or perhaps tension from spending too many hours hunched over financial documents. I set down my book and tried some deep breathing exercises, telling myself that it would pass in a few minutes. But instead of subsiding, the sensation grew, stronger and more alarming. The tightness became a squeezing pressure, as if someone were gradually tightening a band around my ribs. My left arm began to ache, and I felt a strange tingling sensation in my jaw and neck that I recognized from health articles I had read about heart attack symptoms. Despite my attempts to stay calm, panic began to creep into my thoughts as I realized that this might be something serious. I tried to stand up from my chair, but the movement triggered a sharp spike in the chest pain that left me gasping for breath. My heart was racing, but not in the normal way that happens during exercise or excitement. This felt erratic and frightening, like my body was malfunctioning in ways I couldn't control. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the house, and I felt a wave of nausea that made me grateful I was still sitting down. For a few minutes, I sat perfectly still in my chair, trying to assess whether the symptoms were getting better or worse. I had always prided myself on being practical and level-headed in crisis situations, qualities that had served me well during the early years of building Murphy Construction, when every day brought new challenges and problems that required immediate solutions. But this was different. This was my own body betraying me in ways that couldn't be fixed through determination and hard work. The pain intensified again, radiating from my chest down my left arm and up into my neck. I knew from countless health awareness campaigns and medical articles that these were classic signs of a heart attack, and that immediate medical attention could be the difference between life and death. Despite my natural inclination to tough things out and avoid bothering other people with my problems, I realized that this was not a situation where stubborn independence would serve me well. I managed to reach for my phone, which I had left on the side table next to my chair. My hands were trembling as I scrolled through my contacts, trying to decide who to call first. My instinct was to dial 911 immediately, but I also knew that Hunter lived only 20 minutes away and would want to be involved in any medical emergency involving his mother. The thought of riding alone in an ambulance and sitting alone in an emergency room while my son learned about my condition secondhand felt almost as frightening as the physical symptoms I was experiencing. Hunter answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar in the way that immediately made me feel less alone and frightened. "Hey, Mom, what's going on? You don't usually call this late." "Hunter?" "I think something might be wrong with my heart," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady despite the panic I was feeling. "I'm having chest pain and trouble breathing. I think I need to go to the hospital." The change in his tone was immediate and dramatic. "Mom, how bad is the pain? Are you having trouble breathing right now? Should I call an ambulance?" "I can breathe, but it's getting harder. The pain is pretty severe, and it's been going on for about 20 minutes now. I don't think I should drive myself." "Absolutely not. Don't move. Don't do anything strenuous. Sarah and I will be there in 15 minutes, and we'll take you to St. Catherine's. Their cardiac unit is excellent, and it's only about 10 minutes from your house." Hearing the concern and immediate responsiveness in Hunter's voice provided some comfort, but the physical symptoms continued to worsen while I waited for them to arrive. I tried to follow the advice I had read about heart attack victims, sitting as still as possible and focusing on slow, steady breathing. But the pain was becoming more intense, and I found myself wondering if this was how Thomas had felt in those final moments before the car accident, facing his own mortality and thinking about all the things he wished he could say to the people he loved. The 15 minutes felt like an hour, but eventually I heard Hunter's key in the front door and his voice calling out to me, "Mom, we're here. How are you feeling?" "About the same," I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. If anything, the symptoms seemed to be getting progressively worse, and I was starting to feel lightheaded in addition to the chest pain and breathing difficulties. Sarah appeared in the doorway first, moving with the efficient purpose I had always admired about her. She was carrying a small bag that she quickly set down before coming to kneel beside my chair. "Ruby, I brought some of your medications and your insurance cards. Can you describe exactly what you're feeling right now?" I explained the progression of symptoms, and I could see her mental catalog of medical knowledge clicking into place as she processed the information. "These sound like classic cardiac symptoms. We need to get you to the hospital immediately." Hunter helped me stand up slowly, supporting my weight as we made our way to the front door. The movement triggered another wave of pain, but I gritted my teeth and focused on the fact that I would be receiving professional medical care within the next half hour. Sarah had thought to bring a pillow from my couch and a bottle of water, small details that showed how quickly and thoroughly she had prepared for this emergency. The drive to St. Catherine's Medical Center was a blur of streetlights and careful conversation designed to keep me calm and alert. Sarah sat in the back seat with me, monitoring my breathing and asking periodic questions about my pain level, while Hunter navigated through the evening traffic with the kind of focused intensity I remembered from his teenage years when he was learning to drive. "The emergency room at St. Catherine's is supposed to be one of the best in the state," Sarah said, her voice taking on the reassuring tone she used when presenting complex information to clients at her pharmaceutical company. "They have board-certified cardiologists on staff 24 hours a day, and their diagnostic equipment is state-of-the-art." As we pulled up to the emergency entrance, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that I would finally be receiving professional medical attention for symptoms that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage, but apprehension about what the doctors might discover and how serious my condition might actually be. Hunter helped me out of the car, while Sarah gathered the bag of medications and personal items she had prepared. The automatic doors of the emergency room opened with a soft whoosh, and suddenly we were inside the bright, sterile environment where my life was about to change in ways I could never have anticipated. This moment, walking through those emergency room doors with my son and daughter-in-law by my side, represented what I thought was the beginning of a medical crisis that would bring our family closer together. I had no way of knowing that it was actually the catalyst for a series of betrayals and revelations that would fundamentally alter my understanding of the people I trusted most in the world. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Medical Center was bustling with the kind of controlled chaos that exists in hospitals during evening hours. Despite the late hour, the waiting area was nearly full with people dealing with various medical emergencies. A construction worker with what appeared to be a badly injured hand, an elderly couple where the husband was holding an ice pack to his forehead, a young mother trying to comfort a feverish toddler, and several other patients whose conditions weren't immediately obvious, but had brought them to seek urgent medical care. Sarah immediately took charge of the situation with the kind of organizational efficiency that had always impressed me about her professional capabilities. While Hunter helped me settle into a wheelchair that a nurse had provided, Sarah approached the registration desk with my insurance cards, driver's license, and the comprehensive list of medications and medical history that she had somehow thought to grab from my kitchen counter during our hurried departure from the house. "We need immediate attention for a 68-year-old woman experiencing severe chest pain, shortness of breath, and radiating pain in her left arm," Sarah told the triage nurse, her voice carrying the confident authority she used when presenting to pharmaceutical executives. "Symptoms began approximately 45 minutes ago and have been progressively worsening." The triage nurse, a professional-looking woman in her 40s with kind but efficient eyes, immediately began taking my vital signs while asking detailed questions about my symptoms. My blood pressure was elevated, which wasn't surprising given the pain and anxiety I was experiencing, but my heart rate was also irregular in ways that clearly concerned her. "Mrs. Murphy, based on what you're describing and what I'm seeing with your vital signs, we're going to treat this as a potential cardiac event," she explained while typing notes into her computer. "That means you'll be prioritized for evaluation, but I need to be honest with you that we have 2 critical cases ahead of you that arrived by ambulance earlier this evening. The cardiologist is currently with those patients, but we should be able to get you seen within the next 2 to 3 hours. 2 to 3 hours. The time frame seemed both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it suggested that my condition wasn't immediately life-threatening, but terrifying because it meant enduring these symptoms for potentially several more hours while wondering what was happening inside my chest. "Is there anything we can do to make her more comfortable while we wait?" Hunter asked, and I could hear the worry in his voice despite his attempts to remain calm and supportive. "We can provide some mild pain relief, and I'll have someone monitor her vital signs every 30 minutes, the nurse replied. "The most important thing is to keep her as calm and comfortable as possible. Stress and anxiety can worsen cardiac symptoms, so having family support during the wait is actually very beneficial." Sarah had completed all the registration paperwork. With the kind of attention to detail that made me grateful she was handling these logistics instead of me. Every form was filled out completely. Every insurance requirement was properly documented, and she had even thought to list Hunter as my emergency contact and healthcare proxy, ensuring that he would be able to make medical decisions on my behalf if I became unable to advocate for myself. "Mom, let's find a quiet spot where you can rest as comfortably as possible," Hunter said, wheeling me toward a section of the waiting area that was slightly removed from the busiest foot traffic. Sarah had claimed 3 chairs in a row, arranging them so that I could elevate my feet if needed and have people on both sides to provide emotional support and assistance. The first hour of waiting passed slowly but peacefully. Hunter sat on my left side, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand or ask how I was feeling, while Sarah positioned herself on my right with her phone and a small notebook where she was recording my symptoms and the times they occurred. She had explained that keeping a detailed timeline might be helpful for the cardiologist when I was finally called back for evaluation. "I'm so grateful you 2 were available to bring me here," I told them during a moment when the chest pain had subsided slightly. "I don't know what I would have done if I'd had to handle this alone." "Mom, you never have to worry about handling medical emergencies alone," Hunter replied immediately. "Sarah and I will always be here for you, no matter what time of day or night. That's what family is for." Sarah nodded emphatically. "Ruby, you've been like a second mother to me since Hunter and I got married. Taking care of you isn't an obligation. It's something we want to do because we love you." Their words provided comfort that went beyond the physical relief of having practical support during a frightening medical situation. This was exactly the kind of family bond I had hoped would develop when Hunter married Sarah. The knowledge that they saw caring for me as a privilege rather than a burden made me feel less anxious about the aging process and the increasing likelihood that I would need more support in the years to come. During the second hour, Sarah demonstrated her pharmaceutical industry knowledge by asking informed questions about my symptoms and helping me understand what the various tests and evaluations might involve once I was seen by the medical team. She explained the difference between different types of cardiac events, described the diagnostic procedures I might undergo, and reassured me about the excellent reputation of St. Catherine's Cardiac Department. "The head of cardiology here, Dr. Everly Gray, is actually someone I've worked with professionally," Sarah mentioned. "She was the principal investigator for one of our clinical trials about 3 years ago, and I was incredibly impressed with her expertise and patient care philosophy. If she's the one who ends up treating you, you'll be in excellent hands." Hunter had been handling the practical details of our extended hospital stay, making trips to the vending machines to get water and snacks, checking with the nurses about updates on my status, and fielding phone calls from concerned family members. His sister Autumn, who lived in California, had been notified about my condition and was making arrangements to fly out if my situation became more serious. Autumn wanted me to tell you that she's thinking about you and praying for a quick recovery, Hunter reported after one of his phone conversations. She said to remind you that Murphy women are tougher than nails and that this is just another challenge you're going to overcome. The reference to Murphy women made me smile despite my discomfort. It was something my late mother-in-law used to say about the strength and resilience that seemed to run in Thomas's family, and it had become a kind of family motto during the difficult years after his death when I was building the construction company and raising Hunter as a single mother. Around 11:30 p.m., approximately 3 hours after we had arrived at the hospital, Hunter's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID with a frown, then stepped away from our seating area to answer the call. I could see him through the large windows that looked out onto the parking area, pacing back and forth while engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. When he returned, his expression was troubled in a way that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked. "There's a problem at the Morrison project site," he said, and I could hear reluctance in his voice, as if he was delivering news he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "The foundation pour that was scheduled for tomorrow morning is having complications. The concrete supplier is saying there are issues with the mixture specifications, and if we don't resolve this tonight, we'll have to delay the entire project by at least a week." The Morrison project was indeed significant, a $2.8 million commercial development that represented the largest contract Murphy Construction had ever been awarded. The client was notoriously demanding and had made it clear that any delays would result in financial penalties that could seriously impact our profit margins. "How serious is the problem?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this conversation was heading. "Serious enough that I need to be there to make decisions about structural modifications and coordinate with the engineering team," Hunter replied. "The problem is that I'm the only one authorized to approve changes to the foundation specifications, and the concrete crew is threatening to walk off the job if we don't have answers by midnight." I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with my cardiac symptoms. The rational part of my mind understood that losing the Morrison contract would indeed be devastating for Murphy Construction. But the vulnerable part of me that was sitting in an emergency room with chest pain and an irregular heartbeat desperately wanted my son to prioritize my health over business concerns. Maybe someone else could handle it, I suggested weakly, knowing even as I spoke that there probably wasn't anyone else with the authority and expertise to resolve a complex foundation engineering problem. Sarah jumped in at that point, her voice taking on the practical problem-solving tone she used when managing complex situations at work. "Ruby, I can stay with you while Hunter handles this emergency. I'm familiar with medical terminology. I can advocate for you with the medical staff, and I'll call Hunter the minute you're taken back to see the cardiologist." The logic was sound, and I could see that Hunter was genuinely torn between his concern for my welfare and his responsibility to protect the business that represented both our financial security and the legacy I had spent decades building. Losing the Morrison contract really could have devastating long-term consequences for Murphy Construction. "Are you sure you'll be comfortable staying here with Sarah?" Hunter asked, and I could see the guilt and worry in his eyes. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to project more confidence than I actually felt. "Sarah will take excellent care of me, and you need to protect the business we've worked so hard to build." Hunter kissed my forehead with the same gentle affection he had shown me since childhood, his lips warm against my skin as he whispered, "I love you, Mom. I'll be back before you know it, and Sarah will call me the second anything changes with your condition." He squeezed my hand one final time, gathered his jacket and car keys, and walked toward the emergency room exit with the purposeful stride of someone who was already mentally shifting focus to the crisis that demanded his immediate attention. Watched him disappear through the automatic doors, fighting down a wave of abandonment anxiety that felt disproportionate to the situation. After all, Sarah was still here with me, and Hunter was handling a legitimate business emergency that could have serious financial consequences for our family. The rational part of my mind understood that he was making the responsible choice, protecting the company that represented my life's work and our financial security. But the vulnerable part of me, the part that was experiencing frightening cardiac symptoms and sitting in an emergency room surrounded by strangers, felt hurt and confused by his departure. In all the years since Thomas had died and I had been raising Hunter as a single mother, I had never once put business concerns ahead of his welfare. When he had pneumonia at age 12 and spent 3 days in the hospital, I had canceled important client meetings and delayed project deadlines to stay by his bedside. When he had broken his arm during a high school football game, I had left. A crucial contract negotiation to rush to the emergency room and hold his hand during the x-rays and casting procedure. "He'll be back soon," Sarah said, settling into Hunter's vacant chair and reaching over to pat my arm reassuringly. "The Morrison project really is critical for Murphy Construction's reputation. If word gets around that we can't handle complex engineering problems under pressure, it could affect our ability to bid on similar contracts in the future." Her words made sense, and I appreciated that she understood the business implications of the situation. Sarah had always been supportive of Hunter's role in Murphy Construction, and she had shown genuine interest in the company's growth and success over the years. Her pharmaceutical industry background gave her insight into project management and client relations that had been valuable during family discussions about business strategy. "I know you're right," I said, trying to focus on practical concerns rather than emotional ones. "It's just that I've never been in a situation like this before. I've always been the one taking care of other people during medical emergencies, not the one who needs taking care of." "That's completely understandable," Sarah replied. "But you're not alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until Hunter gets back and we know you're okay." For the next hour, Sarah was the perfect companion during a stressful medical situation. She kept me distracted with gentle conversation about her work projects and upcoming family events, periodically checked with the nursing staff about updates on my status, and made sure I stayed hydrated and as comfortable as possible in the hard plastic waiting room chairs. She even used her pharmaceutical connections to get information about Dr. Everly Gray's schedule, learning that the cardiologist was expected to finish with her current patients within the next hour. Around 1 a.m., Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID with a slight frown, then stood up and moved a few steps away to answer the call. I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about timing and logistics and being sure this is the right approach, but the specifics were too muffled for me to understand clearly. When she returned to her seat, her demeanor had changed subtly. She seemed more distracted, checking her phone more frequently and glancing toward the emergency room entrance as if she was expecting someone to arrive or was anxious about something outside our immediate situation. "Everything okay?" I asked, noting the shift in her behavior. "Just work stuff," she replied, but her answer felt rehearsed in the same way Hunter's had when he received those initial phone calls about the construction emergency. "One of my clinical trials is having some complications, and my team is working late to resolve the issues." Another hour passed, and my chest pain, which had seemed to stabilize somewhat during the earlier part of the evening, began to intensify again. The tightness in my chest became more pronounced, and I started experiencing episodes of shortness of breath that left me feeling lightheaded and anxious. I mentioned these changes to Sarah, expecting her to immediately notify the nursing staff or suggest that we request an update on when I might be seen by the cardiologist. Instead, she seemed oddly reluctant to bring these new symptoms to anyone's attention. "Let's wait a few more minutes and see if it passes," she suggested. "Sometimes stress and fatigue can make cardiac symptoms feel worse than they actually are. We don't want to seem like we're panicking over normal fluctuations." Her response surprised me. Earlier in the evening, she had been proactive about monitoring my condition and advocating for my care. Now she seemed almost dismissive of my concerns, more focused on her phone and whatever work crisis was demanding her attention than on the potentially serious changes in my medical status. At 2:30 a.m., Sarah received another phone call. This time, instead of stepping away to maintain privacy, she answered right beside me, speaking in hushed tones that made it impossible for me to follow the conversation, but obvious that she was discussing something she didn't want me to overhear. "I understand," she said finally. "Yes, I think that's the best approach. I'll handle things on this end." When she hung up, she turned to me with an expression that seemed forced, artificial in a way that reminded me of the overly bright smiles that salespeople use when they're trying to convince you to buy something you don't really need. "Ruby, I'm so sorry, but I need to step out for a little while," she said. "There's an emergency with one of my clinical trials, and I need to drive to the research facility to handle some documentation issues. If I don't deal with this tonight, we could lose FDA approval for a medication that could help thousands of patients." I stared at her in disbelief, trying to process what she was telling me. Hunter had left 4 hours ago to handle a construction emergency, and now Sarah was planning to abandon me as well for work-related reasons. The timing seemed impossible to believe. What were the odds that both of them would face career-critical emergencies on the same night that I was experiencing a medical crisis? "How long will you be gone?" I asked, hearing the hurt and confusion in my own voice. "Probably just an hour or two. The research facility is only about 20 minutes from here, and once I get the documentation sorted out, I can drive straight back." "You probably won't even be called back to see the doctor before I return." The logic was similar to what Hunter had presented earlier, but something about Sarah's explanation felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Her emergency had materialized suddenly after several mysterious phone calls, and her demeanor had changed from caring and attentive to distracted and eager to leave. "Sarah, I'm scared," I admitted. "My symptoms are getting worse and I really don't want to be alone right now. Can't someone else handle the documentation issues?" She looked genuinely conflicted for a moment, and I thought she might reconsider her decision to leave. But then her phone buzzed with what appeared to be a text message, and after reading it, her expression hardened with resolve. "Ruby, I know this is frightening, but you're in excellent hands here. The nursing staff is monitoring your condition, and Dr. Gray will see you as soon as she's available. I'll be back before you know it, and if anything changes while I'm gone, the hospital has all our contact information." She gathered her purse and jacket with the same efficiency she had shown earlier when helping me with registration paperwork. "I'll leave my phone on, and I'll call to check on your status in about an hour. Try to rest, and remember that cardiac symptoms often feel worse when you're anxious and tired." And then, just like Hunter before her, Sarah walked away, leaving me alone in the emergency room with my worsening symptoms and growing realization that something was very wrong with the story I was being told about these simultaneous work emergencies. As I watched her disappear through the same automatic doors that had swallowed Hunter hours earlier, I felt a cold understanding settle over me like a heavy blanket. The two people I trusted most in the world, the people who had promised to take care of me during this medical crisis, had both found urgent reasons to be elsewhere when I needed them most. For the first time since my symptoms had begun that evening, I wondered if I was truly experiencing a heart attack, or if the chest pain and breathing difficulties were being triggered by the emotional trauma of realizing that my son and daughter-in-law had coordinated their abandonment of me in ways that suggested planning rather than coincidence. The emergency room suddenly felt much larger and lonelier than it had when I arrived 6 hours earlier, surrounded by the love and support of family members who had promised never to leave me alone in my time of need. The emergency room clock seemed to move with deliberate slowness as I sat alone in that uncomfortable plastic chair, watching the digital numbers change from 3 a.m. to 3:15 to 3:30. The chest pain that had brought me here was now accompanied by a different kind of ache, the hollow, sinking feeling that comes from realizing you've been systematically abandoned by the people you trust most in the world. Around me, the late-night emergency room population had shifted to a different demographic than the early evening crowd. The construction worker with the injured hand had been treated and released hours ago, replaced by a young man who appeared to be suffering from alcohol poisoning and an elderly woman who was having difficulty breathing. The fluorescent lights continued their incessant buzzing, and the smell of disinfectant seemed stronger now, mixing with the coffee that the night shift nurses were brewing behind the reception desk. I tried to focus on my breathing and monitor my symptoms the way Sarah had taught me earlier in the evening, but my mind kept returning to the strange sequence of events that had led to my current isolation. Hunter's construction emergency had seemed urgent and legitimate when he first received those phone calls, but now I was beginning to question details that hadn't seemed significant at the time. The Morrison project was indeed important to Murphy. Construction. But Hunter had never before handled foundation problems personally. We employed several experienced project managers and had relationships with engineering consultants who were specifically trained to handle complex structural issues. Why would a concrete mixing problem require the personal attention of the company's vice president at midnight on a weeknight? Similarly, Sarah's pharmaceutical emergency was starting to feel suspicious under closer examination. She had mentioned FDA documentation that needed immediate attention, but in her 6 years of working in the pharmaceutical industry, she had never once described a situation where clinical trial paperwork required middle-of-the-night intervention. Most regulatory agencies operated during normal business hours, and even the most urgent compliance issues typically allowed for responses within 24 to 48 hours. At 4 a.m., I approached the nursing station to ask about an update on my status and to express concern about my worsening symptoms. The night shift charge nurse, a compassionate woman named Vivian Ross who appeared to be in her 50s, reviewed my chart and took another set of vital signs. "Mrs. Murphy, your blood pressure is still elevated, and I'm seeing some irregularities in your heart rhythm that weren't as pronounced when you first arrived," she said with obvious concern. "I'm going to speak with Dr. Gray about moving you up in the queue. These changes suggest that your condition may be more serious than we initially assessed." "My family members had to step out for work emergencies," I explained. "Should I try to contact them and ask them to return?" Nurse Ross gave me a look that was both professional and sympathetic. "Mrs. Murphy, in my 23 years of emergency room experience, I've learned that true medical emergencies tend to bring families together rather than scatter them to handle other obligations. If your symptoms are worsening, your family should probably be here with you." Her words confirmed what I had been trying not to acknowledge for the past several hours. The timing of Hunter and Sarah's simultaneous departures was not coincidental bad luck, but evidence of priorities that placed my health and safety somewhere below business concerns and work obligations. I returned to my seat and tried calling Hunter's cell phone. The call went directly to voicemail, which was unusual since he typically kept his phone on and available 24 hours a day for construction emergencies. I left a message explaining that my symptoms were worsening and asking him to return to the hospital as soon as possible. My call to Sarah also went to voicemail, with the same immediate transfer that suggested her phone was either turned off or deliberately set to avoid incoming calls. This was even more concerning, since she had specifically promised to keep her phone on and check in with me periodically while handling her pharmaceutical emergency. By 5 a.m., I was beginning to feel genuine panic about both my medical condition and the increasingly obvious fact that Hunter and Sarah had no intention of returning to the hospital. My chest pain was now constant rather than intermittent, and I was experiencing episodes of dizziness that made me grateful to be sitting down. More frightening than the physical symptoms was the growing certainty that I was facing this medical crisis completely alone, abandoned by the two people who had promised to care for me. I tried calling Hunter's home phone, thinking that perhaps there was a reasonable explanation for why both their cell phones were unavailable. The call rang 4 times before going to their answering machine, which featured Sarah's voice cheerfully explaining that they were unavailable to take your call right now, but please leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. 3. Normalcy of the message felt jarring given the circumstances. If Hunter was dealing with a construction emergency serious enough to pull him away from his mother's medical crisis, and if Sarah was handling FDA documentation that required immediate attention, why did their answering machine sound like they were simply choosing not to answer the phone rather than being unavailable due to work emergencies? At 5:30 a.m., Dr. Everly Gray finally appeared in the waiting area, looking for me. She was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and the kind of competent, no-nonsense demeanor that immediately inspired confidence. Despite the early hour, she appeared alert and focused, moving with the efficiency of someone who was accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Mrs. Murphy, I'm Dr. Gray. I understand you've been waiting several hours, and I apologize for the delay. We've had some critical cases that required immediate attention, but your symptoms are concerning enough that I want to evaluate you right away." She helped me into a wheelchair and escorted me to an examination room where she could conduct a thorough cardiac assessment. The relief of finally receiving professional medical attention was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization that I was facing this potentially serious diagnosis without any family support. "Where are your family members?" Dr. Gray asked while reviewing my chart and the notes that various nurses had made throughout the evening. "The registration paperwork indicates that your son and daughter-in-law brought you in, but I don't see anyone in the waiting area with you." "They both had work emergencies," I explained, feeling embarrassed by how inadequate the explanation sounded when spoken aloud to a medical professional. "My son is handling a construction crisis, and my daughter-in-law had a pharmaceutical emergency that required her immediate attention." Dr. Gray paused in her chart review and looked at me with an expression that was both professional and slightly incredulous. "Mrs. Murphy, based on your symptoms and the changes we've documented over the past several hours, you're potentially experiencing a serious cardiac event. Are you telling me that your family members chose to handle work obligations rather than stay with you during this medical emergency?" Hearing the situation described so bluntly by a medical professional made the abandonment feel even more shocking and inexcusable. "They said they would return as soon as they resolved their respective crises," I said weakly. "When was the last time you heard from either of them?" Dr. Gray asked. "My daughter-in-law left around 2:30 a.m., and my son left around midnight. I've tried calling both of them, but their phones are going directly to voicemail." Dr. Gray was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing not just my medical information, but the family dynamics that had resulted in me being alone during a potential cardiac emergency. "Mrs. Murphy, I need to be direct with you about your condition. The EKG we're going to run and the blood work we need to do will help us determine whether you're having a heart attack, but even if you're not, the symptoms you're experiencing require monitoring and potentially medication management. This is not the kind of situation where family members typically prioritize work obligations." Her words were like a physical blow, confirming what I had been trying not to acknowledge for the past several hours. Hunter and Sarah hadn't been called, away by legitimate emergencies. They had chosen to leave me alone during what might be the most serious medical crisis of my life. "Is there anyone else you can call?" Dr. Gray asked gently. "Other family members, close friends, someone who can provide support during your treatment and recovery?" The question highlighted just how isolated I had become. Hunter and Sarah had been my primary emotional support system for years, and I hadn't maintained close relationships with many other people. My business success had required such intensive focus that I had allowed my social connections to atrophy, trusting that my immediate family would always be available when I needed them. "My daughter Autumn lives in California," I said, "but I don't want to frighten her unnecessarily if this turns out to be something minor." "Mrs. Murphy," Dr. Gray said firmly, "this is not minor, and if your son and daughter-in-law are not going to be here to support you, you need someone who will be." As she prepared to run the diagnostic tests that would determine the extent of my cardiac problems, I realized that I was facing not just a medical crisis, but a fundamental reassessment of everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Hunter and Sarah. The abandonment was bad enough, but the coordinated nature of their departures suggested something much more troubling than simple poor judgment or misplaced priorities. Dr. Gray's diagnostic tests confirmed what we had both suspected. I was indeed experiencing a cardiac event, though fortunately not a full heart attack. The EKG showed irregular rhythms consistent with severe stress-induced cardiomyopathy, and my blood work revealed elevated enzymes that indicated my heart was under significant strain. She admitted me for observation and monitoring, explaining that my condition required at least 24 hours of supervised care to ensure my heart rhythm stabilized and my symptoms didn't worsen. By 8:08 a.m., I was settled in a private room on the cardiac wing, connected to monitors that tracked my heart rate and blood pressure, while IV medications helped manage the chest pain and irregular rhythms. The morning shift nurse, a kind woman named Paisley Morgan, had helped me contact Autumn in California to explain my condition and assure her that while the situation was serious, I was receiving excellent care and was expected to make a full recovery. Autumn had been shocked to learn that Hunter and Sarah were not at the hospital with me. "Mom, I don't understand," she had said during our phone conversation. "You're having a heart episode, and Hunter left to handle a construction problem. That doesn't sound like him at all. He's always been so protective of you, so protective of you." Her confusion echoed my own. The Hunter I had raised, the son who had rushed to my side when I had the flu or sprained my ankle, would never have prioritized business concerns over my health and safety. Something fundamental had changed in his character, or perhaps I had never truly understood his priorities as clearly as I thought I did. Around 10 a.m., I finally received a phone call from Hunter. His voice sounded strained and oddly formal when he asked about my condition and apologized for not returning to the hospital the previous night. "The foundation crisis turned out to be more complex than we initially thought," he explained. "We ended up working straight through the night to prevent the entire project from collapsing. How are you feeling now?" "I've been admitted for observation," I told him, watching his reaction carefully even though we were speaking by phone. "Dr. Gray says I'm experiencing stress-induced cardiomyopathy, which could have been serious if I hadn't received treatment when I did." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Stress-induced cardiomyopathy," he repeated slowly. "So it wasn't actually a heart attack?" Something about his tone bothered me. He sounded almost relieved that my condition had turned out to be less severe than initially feared, but in a way that suggested personal benefit rather than maternal concern. "Hunter, it was still a serious cardiac event that required hospitalization. The doctor said that if my symptoms had gone untreated much longer, it could have progressed to something more dangerous." "Of course, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'll come visit you this afternoon once I get caught up on some urgent paperwork from last night's crisis." Again, the priorities seemed backwards. If your mother has been hospitalized with a cardiac condition, urgent paperwork should be secondary to visiting her and ensuring she has the support she needs during recovery. But I didn't press the issue, partly because I was still feeling weak, and partly because I was beginning to understand that direct confrontation might not reveal the truth about what was happening with my family relationships. That afternoon, instead of visiting me at the hospital, Hunter sent flowers with a card that read, "Thinking of you during your recovery. Love, Hunter and Sarah." The gesture felt impersonal and inadequate, like something you might send to a business acquaintance rather than your hospitalized mother. Sarah called around 2:00 p.m., her voice carrying the same strained quality I had noticed in Hunter's earlier conversation. She apologized for not returning to the hospital the previous night, explaining that her pharmaceutical emergency had required her to stay at the research facility until dawn to prevent significant regulatory complications. "I feel terrible about leaving you alone," she said, though her tone suggested she was reading from a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. "But the FDA documentation issue could have affected thousands of patients if we hadn't resolved it immediately." "Sarah, I was hospitalized with a heart condition," I said, unable to keep a note of hurt from creeping into my voice. Doesn't that take priority over work responsibilities? Of course it does, she replied quickly. But you were in excellent hands at the hospital, and we knew that Dr. Gray would provide the best possible care. Sometimes the most loving thing family members can do is handle external stresses so that the patient can focus entirely on recovery. Her logic was sophisticated but felt wrong in fundamental ways. Family members don't typically abandon hospitalized relatives to handle external stresses. They delegate those responsibilities to other people so they can provide emotional support during medical crises. The breakthrough came on my second day in the hospital when Nurse Morgan mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. Mrs. Murphy, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you related to the Hunter Hall who owns Hall Development Group? I stared at her in confusion. I think there might be some mistake. My son is Hunter Hall, but he works for Murphy Construction, the company I founded. I don't know anything about Hall Development Group. Nurse Morgan looked equally confused. That's odd. I could have sworn I saw Hunter Hall's name in the local business journal last week, announcing a major commercial development project. Let me see if I can find the article. She returned 20 minutes later with a printout from the Willowbrook Business Journal website, and what I saw made my chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with my cardiac condition. The headline read, Hall Development Group announces $4.2 million commercial complex. And the accompanying photograph showed Hunter shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize in front of architectural renderings for a project I had never heard of. According to the article, Hall Development Group was a newly formed company that had been awarded the contract for the Morrison Commercial Complex, the same project that Hunter had claimed was experiencing foundation problems requiring his immediate attention the night I was hospitalized. But instead of working as a vice president for Murphy Construction, he was identified as the founder and CEO of his own competing company. The article was dated 3 days ago, which meant Hunter had established his own construction business and secured the Morrison contract while still supposedly working for Murphy Construction. More troubling was the realization that there had been no foundation emergency requiring his attention. The Morrison project was proceeding exactly as scheduled, under the management of his new company. I read the article 3 times, trying to process the implications of what I was learning. Hunter hadn't left the hospital to handle a crisis for Murphy Construction. He had left to meet with clients and contractors for his own competing business, using the Morrison project as a convenient excuse for his abandonment. But the revelations didn't stop there. Further research using the hospital's patient computer terminal revealed additional information about Hall Development Group that made my situation even more devastating. The company had been incorporated 6 months ago, with both Hunter and Sarah listed as founding partners. Sarah's pharmaceutical expertise was being marketed as an asset for projects involving medical facilities and research complexes. They had been planning their departure from Murphy Construction for half a year, establishing their own competing business while still drawing salaries from the company I had built and still living in the house I had helped them purchase. The night of my hospitalization, when they claimed to be handling separate work emergencies, they had actually been meeting with investors and contractors to finalize deals for their new company. The Morrison project that had supposedly required Hunter's immediate attention was actually a contract that Hall Development Group had secured by underbidding Murphy Construction, essentially using inside information about our costs and margins to undercut our proposals and steal our clients. As I sat in that hospital bed, surrounded by cardiac monitors and IV equipment, I realized that my chest pain and irregular heart rhythms weren't just the result of a medical condition. They were my body's response to the devastating betrayal of discovering that my son and daughter-in-law had been systematically planning to destroy the business I had spent decades building, while using my illness as cover for advancing their own competing interests. The family I thought I had, the loyal son I thought I had raised, the caring daughter-in-law I thought I had gained. None of it was real. Hunter and Sarah had been living double lives, pretending to support Murphy Construction while secretly working to undermine it. pretending to care about my welfare while actually viewing my medical emergency as an opportunity to advance their own business agenda. The worst part was understanding that my hospitalization had been convenient for their purposes. While I was incapacitated and unable to oversee Murphy Construction's operations, they could finalize deals and secure contracts without my knowledge or interference. My cardiac event had provided the perfect cover for their corporate espionage and business betrayal. Dr. Gray found me crying when she made her evening rounds, and after I explained what I had discovered about Hunter and Sarah's deception, she sat down in the chair beside my bed with an expression of professional concern mixed with personal sympathy. "Mrs. Murphy, I need you to understand that stress and emotional trauma can significantly worsen cardiac conditions like yours. The betrayal you've discovered is the kind of shock that can trigger additional cardiac events." "So they're not just stealing my business," I said through my tears. "They're literally breaking my heart." Dr. Gray's warning about stress and cardiac complications proved prophetic over the next few days as additional revelations continued to surface, each one more devastating than the last. What I had initially discovered about Hall Development Group turned out to be merely the tip of an iceberg of deception that ran much deeper than simple business competition. On my third day in the hospital, I received an unexpected visit from Jesse Morgan, the longtime accountant who had managed Murphy Construction's finances for the past 15 years. Jesse was a meticulous professional who had helped me navigate complex tax situations and business growth challenges, and his presence in my hospital room immediately signaled that something was seriously wrong beyond what I had already discovered. "Ruby, I'm sorry to bother you while you're recovering," Jesse said, his normally calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety and concern. "But there are some financial irregularities that I need to discuss with you immediately. I've been trying to reach Hunter for 3 days, but his calls are going straight to voicemail. And when I went to the office yesterday, I was told he was handling urgent client meetings." Jesse opened his briefcase and spread several documents across the adjustable table that swung over my hospital bed. I discovered these discrepancies while preparing the quarterly reports. Over the past 6 months, there have been numerous unauthorized transfers from Murphy Construction's operating accounts, small amounts individually, but they add up to approximately $180,000. I stared at the bank statements and transfer records, trying to process what I was seeing. The transactions were all authorized with Hunter's digital signature and executive access codes, making them appear legitimate on the surface. But the receiving accounts belonged to companies and contractors I didn't recognize, and the stated purposes for the transfers, equipment purchases, subcontractor payments, material deposits, didn't correspond to any projects I had approved or overseen. "Jesse, are you telling me that Hunter has been stealing money from Murphy Construction?" I asked. Though even as I spoke the words, I knew the answer was obvious from the documentation spread before me. "It appears that way," Jesse confirmed reluctantly. "The transfers are structured to avoid triggering automatic audit alerts. No single transaction exceeds $15,000, and they're spread across different account categories to make them less noticeable during routine reviews. This suggests sophisticated knowledge of our financial systems and deliberate intent to conceal the activity." The systematic nature of the theft was almost as shocking as the betrayal itself. Hunter hadn't impulsively taken money during a moment of financial desperation. He had been carefully siphoning funds from Murphy Construction for months, using his insider access and knowledge of our accounting procedures to steal systematically, while avoiding detection. "There's more," Jesse continued, and his expression suggested that the additional information would be even more difficult to hear. "I've traced some of these unauthorized transfers to accounts belonging to Hall Development Group. It appears that Hunter has been using Murphy Construction's money to fund his competing business, essentially forcing you to finance your own competition." The violation felt complete and devastating. Not only had Hunter stolen our clients by underbidding our contracts with inside information, he had stolen our money to capitalize his new company, making Murphy Construction an unwilling investor in the business that was designed to destroy us. How much total exposure are we looking at? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of the financial damage. Jesse consulted his notes with the grim efficiency of an accountant delivering bad news. Based on the patterns I've identified, I estimate that approximately $250,000 has been diverted from Murphy Construction over the past 8 months. Some of that went directly to Hall Development Group, but significant amounts were transferred to personal accounts belonging to Hunter and Sarah, $250,000, money that I had earned through decades of 18-hour days and weekend work sessions, money that was supposed to ensure Murphy Construction's financial stability and growth, money that represented my life's work and my legacy to the next generation. Hunter had stolen it systematically and used it to finance a competing business that was designed to drive Murphy Construction into bankruptcy. Jesse, I need you to freeze Hunter's access to all Murphy Construction accounts immediately, I said. Feeling a cold determination replaced the hurt and confusion I had been experiencing. Change all passwords, revoke his authorization codes, and contact our bank to report unauthorized transactions. I was hoping you would say that, Jesse replied with obvious relief. I've already prepared the necessary paperwork to remove Hunter from all financial accounts and limit his access to company resources. But Ruby, there's something else we need to discuss. He pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of Murphy Construction's business insurance company. Hunter submitted a life insurance claim application on your behalf 3 weeks ago, listing himself as the sole beneficiary and claiming that you had been diagnosed with a terminal cardiac condition. I felt the cardiac monitors beside my bed begin beeping more rapidly as my heart rate spiked in response to this new revelation. Jesse, what are you telling me? The insurance company contacted me for verification of your medical condition and to confirm that the beneficiary designation was legitimate. When I told them I wasn't aware of any terminal diagnosis, they flagged the application as potentially fraudulent and launched an investigation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Hunter hadn't just been stealing money from Murphy Construction. He had been positioning himself to benefit from my death, filing insurance claims based on false medical information and attempting to secure financial benefits that would only pay out if I died. The timing is particularly suspicious, Jesse continued, given that he filed the claim just 3 weeks before your actual cardiac event. It's almost as if he was anticipating that you might experience a medical emergency. Dr. Gray, who had been monitoring my cardiac responses during Jesse's visit, immediately intervened when the stress of these revelations triggered irregular heart rhythms that required additional medication. Mr. Morgan, I need you to pause this conversation. Mrs. Murphy's cardiac condition is being exacerbated by the emotional stress of these discoveries, but I couldn't stop now. Not when I was finally understanding the full scope of what Hunter and Sarah had been planning. Doctor, I need to hear all of this. I need to understand what they were doing while I was trusting them with my business and my life. After Dr. Gray had adjusted my medications and my heart rate had stabilized, Jesse continued with the most disturbing revelation yet. Ruby, I contacted our corporate attorney to discuss the unauthorized financial transfers and the fraudulent insurance application. He discovered that Hunter has also been meeting with potential buyers for Murphy Construction, representing himself as the owner-operator and providing confidential financial information to companies that specialize in acquiring distressed construction businesses. He's been trying to sell Murphy Construction? I asked, though by now I shouldn't have been surprised by any level of betrayal. Worse than that, Jesse replied. Based on the correspondence our attorney was able to obtain, it appears that Hunter was negotiating a sale price significantly below market value, with the understanding that the buyers would retain him as CEO while liquidating most of the existing assets and staff. He was essentially arranging to sell your life's work at a BE discount in exchange for personal job security. The complete picture was now emerging with crystal clarity. Hunter and Sarah hadn't just decided to start their own competing business. They had developed a comprehensive plan to systematically destroy Murphy Construction while maximizing their personal benefit from its demise. They had stolen money to finance their new company, stolen clients through insider information, filed fraudulent insurance claims to benefit from my death, and negotiated the sale of Murphy Construction to buyers who would eliminate the competition for Hall Development Group. My hospitalization hadn't been an inconvenient interruption to their plans. It had been a crucial component of their strategy. While I was incapacitated and unable to oversee Murphy Construction's operations, they could finalize the financial transactions and business deals that would complete their takeover and liquidation of everything I had built. "Jesse," I said, feeling a strength and determination that surprised me given my physical condition, "I want you to contact the district attorney's office. What Hunter and Sarah have done isn't just business competition or family betrayal, it's systematic fraud, embezzlement, and potentially attempted murder if they were counting on my death to complete their financial scheme." "I was hoping you would want to pursue criminal charges," Jesse replied. "The documentation of financial fraud is extensive, and the fraudulent insurance application provides clear evidence of intent to benefit from your death." As Jesse gathered his documents and prepared to leave, promising to initiate both criminal complaints and civil litigation to recover the stolen funds, I realized that my cardiac event had been more than a medical emergency. It had been the catalyst that exposed a conspiracy that had been developing for months, a systematic betrayal that would have eventually destroyed both Murphy Construction and my personal financial security. Hunter and Sarah had gambled that I would either die from my cardiac condition or be too weakened by illness to effectively fight back against their theft and deception. They had seriously underestimated the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing and had survived every challenge that life had thrown at her for 68 years. The heart monitors continued their steady beeping as I contemplated the legal and financial battles that lay ahead. But for the first time since my hospitalization began, the rhythm was strong and regular, reflecting not just physical healing, but emotional resolution and the steely determination that had carried me through every crisis I had ever faced. On my 5th day in the hospital, just as Dr. Gray was discussing discharge plans and my transition to outpatient cardiac rehabilitation, Hunter and Sarah finally appeared in my room. They arrived together, carrying flowers and wearing expressions of concern that might have fooled me a week ago, but now struck me as carefully rehearsed performances designed to maintain their facade of caring family members. "Mom, you look so much better," Hunter said, leaning down to kiss my forehead with the same gentle affection he had shown the night they brought me to the emergency room. "We've been so worried about you." Sarah positioned herself on the other side of my bed, reaching for my hand with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Ruby, I'm so sorry we haven't been able to visit sooner. Hunter's construction crisis turned into a week-long nightmare, and my pharmaceutical emergency required round-the-clock attention to prevent serious regulatory violations." I looked at them both, these two people who had shared my home and my family meals and my trust for years, and felt a cold calm settle over me that was far more powerful than the anger or hurt I had been experiencing. They had no idea that I knew about Hall Development Group, about the stolen money, about the fraudulent insurance application, or about their systematic plan to destroy Murphy Construction while benefiting from my death. "I'm glad you're both here," I said, my voice steady and controlled. "We need to talk about some important family matters." Hunter settled into the chair beside my bed, still maintaining his performance of concerned son dealing with his mother's medical crisis. "Of course, Mom. What's on your mind?" "I've had a lot of time to think while I've been recovering," I began, watching their faces carefully for any signs of nervousness or guilt. "About family, about loyalty, about the people we trust with our most important relationships and responsibilities." Sarah squeezed my hand gently. "Recovery time is always a good opportunity for reflection. What conclusions have you reached?" "I've concluded that some people are exactly who they appear to be," I said, continuing to study their reactions, "and some people are very skilled at pretending to be something they're not." Hunter frowned slightly, the first crack in his facade of confident concern. Mom, that sounds a little philosophical for someone who's supposed to be focusing on cardiac rehabilitation. Are you feeling okay emotionally? Sometimes medical trauma can trigger depression or anxiety that affects how we perceive our relationships. His attempt to reframe my growing awareness as a medical symptom was revealing in its sophistication. This wasn't someone who was panicking about being discovered. This was someone who had prepared responses for various scenarios and was skilled at deflecting suspicion. My emotional state is fine, Hunter, I replied calmly. In fact, I think I'm seeing more clearly than I have in months. For instance, I'm seeing that the Morrison project you rushed away to handle the night I was hospitalized seems to be proceeding exactly on schedule. No foundation problems, no concrete crisis, no engineering emergencies that required your immediate attention. The silence that followed was brief but telling. Hunter's expression shifted from concern to calculation, and I could see him trying to determine how much I knew and how to respond without revealing additional information. Mom, construction projects are complex, he said carefully. Sometimes what appears to be running smoothly from the outside actually requires intensive management behind the scenes. The crisis we averted that night prevented problems that would have become visible later. Is that why you established Hall Development Group 6 months ago? I asked, dropping the pretense of ignorance and watching both their faces for genuine reactions. To provide behind-the-scenes management for projects that Murphy Construction couldn't handle? The change in their demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Hunter's concerned expression vanished entirely, replaced by something harder and more calculating. Sarah released my hand and stepped back from the bed, her posture shifting from supportive family member to defensive co-conspirator. How did you find out about Hall Development Group? Hunter asked, his voice taking on a cold edge that I had never heard before. Does it matter how I found out? I replied. What matters is that you've been operating a competing construction business while drawing a salary from Murphy Construction, using inside information to underbid our contracts, and stealing money from our accounts to finance your new company. Sarah spoke for the first time since my revelation, her voice carrying the same calculated tone as Hunter's. Ruby, the business situation is more complicated than you understand. Murphy Construction has been losing market share for the past 2 years, and Hunter was developing contingency plans to protect our family's financial future. By stealing $250,000 from the company I built? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. By filing fraudulent insurance claims based on false medical information? By negotiating to sell Murphy Construction to buyers who would liquidate it at below-market prices? Hunter stood up abruptly, abandoning any pretense of the caring son role he had been playing. Mom, you don't understand the current construction market. Murphy Construction is outdated, inefficient, and operating with business models that worked 20 years ago but aren't sustainable today. Hall Development Group represents the future of commercial construction in this region. So you decided to destroy Murphy Construction to build your future? I asked. You decided to steal from the company that provided your livelihood, your education, your house, your entire standard of living? We decided to protect our financial interests before Murphy Construction collapsed entirely, Sarah said, her pharmaceutical industry training evident in her clinical approach to explaining. Their betrayal. The construction industry is consolidating rapidly, and companies that don't adapt get absorbed by larger competitors. We were positioning ourselves to survive that transition. The coldness of their logic was breathtaking. They weren't apologetic about their theft and deception. They were defending it as sound business strategy, reframing their betrayal as prudent financial planning. And my medical emergency was convenient timing for your business transition? I asked. Hunter's expression became even harder. Your cardiac event was unfortunate, but it didn't change the fundamental reality that Murphy Construction needed new leadership and strategic direction. We couldn't let emotional concerns about your health interfere with necessary business decisions. Emotional concerns about my health? I repeated slowly. You're talking about abandoning your mother in an emergency room during a heart attack as an emotional concern that interfered with business decisions. You weren't having a heart attack, Sarah said with clinical precision. You were experiencing stress-induced cardiomyopathy, which is serious but not immediately life-threatening. We made calculated decisions about where our time and attention would be most valuable that night. The phrase calculated decisions revealed everything I needed to know about their mindset. Even my medical emergency had been subject to cost-benefit analysis, weighed against their business opportunities, and found to be of secondary importance. What about the fraudulent insurance application? I asked. Was that also a calculated business decision? Hunter looked genuinely surprised that I knew about the insurance fraud. How could you possibly know about that? Because unlike you, I have advisors who are actually loyal to me, I replied. Jesse Morgan discovered your fraudulent claim and reported it to both the insurance company and our corporate attorney. For the first time since I had begun confronting them, both Hunter and Sarah looked genuinely concerned rather than simply defensive. Insurance fraud was a federal crime with serious legal consequences, and their theft of Murphy construction funds could be prosecuted as embezzlement. Mom, the insurance application was just contingency planning, Hunter said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the legal jeopardy he had created. We weren't hoping for anything to happen to you. We were just making sure the family would be financially protected if your cardiac condition worsened. By filing claims based on false medical information that suggested I had a terminal diagnosis? I asked. By listing yourself as sole beneficiary without my knowledge or consent? The room fell silent as the full scope of their legal exposure became clear to all three of us. What they had characterized as prudent business planning and contingency preparation was actually systematic fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Crimes that could result in federal prosecution and significant prison sentences. What do you want from us? Sarah asked finally, her clinical mask slipping to reveal genuine fear for the first time since they had entered my room. I want you to understand that your calculated decisions have consequences, I replied, reaching for the phone, beside my hospital bed. And I want you to know that Ruby Murphy is not the helpless elderly victim you thought you were manipulating. As I dialed Jesse Morgan's number to inform him that Hunter and Sarah were ready to discuss the criminal and civil charges that would be filed against them, I watched the two people who had betrayed my trust, stolen my money, and abandoned me. During a medical emergency, finally begin to understand that their sophisticated planning had seriously underestimated the woman they had chosen to target. The heart monitors beside my bed showed strong, steady rhythms as I prepared to reclaim control of my business, my finances, and my life, from the people who had thought my illness and vulnerability made me an easy mark for their calculated deception. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, largely due to the extensive documentation that Jesse Morgan and our corporate attorney had compiled. Within 3 days of my confrontation with Hunter and Sarah in the hospital, criminal charges were filed by the district attorney's office, and federal authorities became involved due to the insurance fraud and interstate nature of some of their financial crimes. Detective Reese Patterson, the lead investigator assigned to the case, visited me during my final day in the hospital to explain the charges and outline what I could expect during the prosecution process. He was a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of patient, methodical demeanor that immediately inspired confidence in his ability to handle complex financial crimes. Mrs. Murphy, we've identified multiple felony charges that will be prosecuted simultaneously, Detective Patterson explained, spreading several legal documents across my hospital bed table. Federal charges include mail fraud, wire fraud, and insurance fraud related to the false life insurance application. State charges include embezzlement, theft, forgery of business documents, and conspiracy. The list of crimes was extensive, reflecting the systematic nature of Hunter and Sarah's deception over the past 8 months. Detective, "What kind of sentences are we looking at if they're convicted on all counts?" I asked. Federal fraud charges typically carry sentences of 10 to 20 years, depending on the amount of money involved and the defendant's criminal history. The embezzlement and theft charges at the state level could add another 5 to 10 years. If convicted on all counts, they could be looking at 25 to 30 years in federal prison. The severity of the potential sentences was sobering, even given the extent of their betrayal. These were people I had loved as family members, and despite everything they had done to me, the thought of them spending decades in prison felt overwhelming. "There's also the matter of civil restitution," Detective Patterson continued. "Our forensic accounting investigation has revealed that the total amount stolen from Murphy Construction is actually higher than initially estimated, approximately $340,000 when you include forged vendor payments, unauthorized equipment purchases, and fraudulent consultant fees." The number was staggering. Hunter and Sarah had been far more systematic in their theft than even Jesse's initial investigation had revealed, using their insider access to steal from virtually every category of Murphy Construction's operating budget. "We've also discovered that they were planning to accelerate their timeline," Detective Patterson added. "Surveillance of their communications shows that they intended to complete the sale of Murphy Construction within the next 60 days, before the end of the fiscal year when more comprehensive audits might have revealed their theft." My cardiac event had actually disrupted their plans in ways they hadn't anticipated. Instead of providing cover for the final phase of their scheme, my hospitalization had led to the accounting review that exposed their crimes and triggered the investigation that would ultimately destroy them. 2 weeks after my discharge from the hospital, I attended the arraignment hearing where Hunter and Sarah formally entered their pleas. The courtroom was packed with reporters, business associates, and family members, creating a circus atmosphere that felt surreal, given the intimate nature of the betrayal at the heart of the case. Hunter and Sarah sat at the defendant's table, with their attorneys, looking smaller and more vulnerable than they had during our confrontation in the hospital. The confident, calculated personas they had displayed when explaining their business strategy had been replaced by the defeated demeanor of people who understood that their sophisticated planning had led to catastrophic consequences. When Judge Garrett Hill asked for their pleas, both Hunter and Sarah stood and quietly said, "Not guilty" to all charges. Their attorneys had apparently advised them to fight the charges rather than accept plea bargains, despite the overwhelming evidence against them. As I sat in the gallery watching my son and daughter-in-law formally deny crimes that were documented by bank records, recorded phone calls, and forged documents, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I hadn't expected. Anger, certainly, and a deep sense of betrayal that would probably never fully heal, but also a profound sadness for the family relationships that had been irreparably destroyed by their greed and deception. The trial began 6 months later, and I testified for 3 days about the history of Murphy Construction, my relationship with Hunter and Sarah, and the events surrounding my cardiac emergency and their abandonment of me in the hospital. The prosecution used my testimony to establish the personal dimension of their crimes. These weren't strangers who had targeted a business opportunity, but family members who had systematically betrayed the trust and love that had been freely given to them. The defense attorneys tried to portray Hunter and Sarah as victims of an aging business owner who refused to modernize her company or plan for succession. They argued that their clients had been forced to take protective action to preserve their financial future, when it became clear that Murphy Construction was heading for bankruptcy under my leadership. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, recorded phone conversations, and email communications all painted a clear picture of calculated fraud and theft that had been planned and executed over many months. The false insurance application was particularly damaging, since it provided clear evidence of their intent to benefit financially from my death. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Hunter and Sarah showed no visible emotion as the verdicts were read, though their attorneys immediately announced plans to appeal the convictions. Judge Hill scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and I spent that time preparing a victim impact statement that would help the court understand the full scope of the damage their crimes had caused to both Murphy Construction and our family relationships. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was again packed with observers as Judge Hill prepared to impose prison terms that would effectively end Hunter and Sarah's freedom for the next several decades. Before announcing the sentences, he allowed me to read my victim impact statement. "Your Honor," I began, standing at the podium facing the judge while Hunter and Sarah sat at the defendant's table behind me. "The defendants in this case didn't just steal money from my business. They stole my faith in family bonds, my trust in the people I loved most, and my belief that the sacrifices I made as a single mother were appreciated and valued." I spoke for 15 minutes about the emotional devastation of their betrayal, the business relationships that had been damaged by their theft, and the employees whose jobs had been jeopardized by their systematic fraud. I also spoke about the physical toll their actions had taken on my health and how their abandonment during my cardiac emergency had worsened my medical condition. But most importantly, I concluded, I want the court to understand that these crimes weren't committed by strangers or casual acquaintances. They were committed by people I trusted with my business, my personal finances, and my life. The violation of that trust deserves consequences that reflect not just the financial damage they caused, but the destruction of family bonds that can never be repaired. Judge Hill sentenced Hunter to 28 years in federal prison and Sarah to 25 years, with requirements to pay full restitution, plus penalties and interest. The sentences were at the high end of federal guidelines, reflecting the judge's recognition that their crimes involved a particularly heinous betrayal of family trust. As Hunter and Sarah were led away in handcuffs to begin serving sentences that would keep them imprisoned until they were in their 60s, I felt a sense of justice that was both satisfying and hollow. They would face consequences for their crimes, and Murphy Construction would eventually recover the money they had stolen. But the family I thought I had, the son I thought I had raised, and the daughter-in-law I thought I had gained were gone forever, destroyed by greed and deception that no amount of prison time could ever truly repair. 6 months after Hunter and Sarah's sentencing, I sat in my home office overlooking the garden that Thomas had planted during our early years in Brookside Heights, reviewing the quarterly financial reports that showed Murphy Construction's remarkable recovery from the systematic theft and betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything I had built over the past 40 years. Jesse Morgan had done exceptional work in recovering the stolen funds and rebuilding our financial systems with safeguards that would prevent future embezzlement. We had not only recovered the $340,000 that Hunter and Sarah had stolen, but the UMCI, federal restitution requirements, had also compensated Murphy Construction for lost business opportunities and damaged client relationships. More importantly, the publicity surrounding their convictions had actually enhanced our reputation as a company with strong ethical standards and financial integrity. The business had stabilized under new leadership that I had carefully selected from our existing management team. Cody Scott, our former project manager, had proven to be an excellent vice president with a genuine commitment to Murphy Construction's values and long-term success. Unlike Hunter, who had viewed the company as his personal inheritance to be exploited for maximum benefit, Cody understood that Murphy Construction belonged to all the employees and clients who depended on our continued success and ethical leadership. "Ruby, I wanted to update you on the Morrison project completion," Cody said during our weekly management meeting. "The client has expressed interest in awarding us the Phase 2 contract, which would be worth approximately $3.2 million. They were particularly impressed with our transparent communication and ethical business practices throughout the project." The irony wasn't lost on me that the Morrison project, which Hunter had used as an excuse to abandon me during my cardiac emergency, had become one of Murphy Construction's most successful contracts under honest leadership. The foundation problems that Hunter had claimed required his immediate attention that night had never existed. They were simply lies designed to justify his abandonment while he met with investors for Hall Development Group. Hall Development. Group itself had collapsed within weeks of Hunter and Sarah's arrest. Their clients had quickly distanced themselves from a company founded on fraud and theft, and their competitors had absorbed the few legitimate contracts they had managed to secure. The business that they had thought would make them wealthy had instead become evidence in their criminal prosecution and a cautionary tale about the consequences of unethical business practices. My personal recovery had been more complex than the business recovery, involving not just the physical healing from my cardiac event, but the emotional process of rebuilding trust and faith in human relationships after such a profound betrayal. Dr. Gray had been right to warn me about the connection between emotional stress and cardiac health. The months following my hospitalization had required careful management of both my heart condition and the psychological trauma of discovering that my own son had been willing to sacrifice my life for his financial gain. The $1 million life insurance policy that had been the target of Hunter's fraudulent application had been updated with new beneficiaries that reflected my current understanding of family loyalty and genuine care. Autumn, who had flown in from California the day after my hospitalization and had remained involved in my recovery process, was now the primary beneficiary. Jesse Morgan, whose integrity and loyalty had saved Murphy Construction, received a significant bequest. The Murphy Construction Employee Trust, which I had established to ensure that our long-term employees would be cared for in retirement, received the largest portion of my estate. Hunter's name had been completely removed from all my financial accounts, legal documents, and estate planning materials. The son who had abandoned me in an emergency room while plotting to steal my business and benefit from my death would receive nothing from the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities he had never earned and didn't deserve. The emotional work of rebuilding my life had been supported by a network of relationships that I had neglected during the years when I was focused primarily on business success and family obligations. Dr. Everly Gray had become not just my cardiologist, but a friend whose medical expertise and personal wisdom had helped me understand that survival sometimes requires letting go of relationships that are fundamentally toxic, even when those relationships involve people we have loved deeply. "Ruby, your cardiac function has returned to normal levels," Dr. Gray told me during a recent appointment. "But more importantly, your emotional stress indicators suggest that removing the source of betrayal from your life has been beneficial for both your heart health and your overall well-being." The church community that I had been part of for decades had also provided support that went beyond religious comfort. Pastor Kinsley King and the congregation at Willowbrook Methodist had surrounded me with practical assistance and emotional encouragement during the months when I was rebuilding both my business and my personal life. They had understood that forgiveness doesn't require maintaining relationships with people who continue to pose dangers to your health and welfare. Forgiveness is about releasing anger and resentment for your own peace of mind, Pastor King had explained during one of our counseling sessions. It doesn't mean pretending that harmful actions didn't occur, or that people who have betrayed your trust deserve continued access to your life and resources. This distinction had been crucial for my healing process. I had forgiven Hunter and Sarah in the sense that I no longer carried active hatred or desire for revenge against them. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting their crimes or pretending that they deserved restored relationships with the family they had systematically betrayed. The most surprising aspect of my recovery had been discovering strengths and capabilities that I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who had been abandoned in an emergency room, confused and vulnerable and trusting people who were actively planning her financial destruction, had been replaced by someone who understood that genuine strength sometimes requires making difficult decisions about which relationships deserve preservation and which ones need to be permanently severed. Murphy Construction was thriving under ethical leadership that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. My personal finances were secure and growing under management that I trusted completely. My health had stabilized with medical care that addressed both the physical and emotional aspects of cardiac recovery. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between family relationships based on genuine love and mutual respect, and family relationships based on financial dependency and manipulative exploitation. Autumn's weekly phone calls and monthly visits reflected authentic care for my well-being, not calculations about inheritance potential. Jesse's loyalty to Murphy Construction was based on professional integrity and shared values, not opportunistic career advancement. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of the peaceful evenings Thomas and I had shared in this same spot decades ago, I felt a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point of clarity and strength. The cardiac event that had initially seemed like a medical crisis had actually been a catalyst for discovering truths that might have remained hidden for years if Hunter and Sarah had been more patient in executing their theft and betrayal. My heart attack had ultimately saved both my life and my business by exposing the conspiracy before it could be completed. The phone rang, interrupting my quiet reflection, and I smiled when I saw Autumn's name on the caller ID. Her voice was warm with genuine concern as she asked about my day and shared news about her family in California. "Mom, I've been thinking about coming out for an extended visit next month," she said. "Not because I'm worried about your health, but because I miss spending time with you and I'd love to help with the Murphy Construction expansion project." Her words reflected the kind of family relationship I had always hoped to have, based on mutual affection and shared interests rather than financial obligations or inheritance expectations. Autumn wanted to spend time with me because she genuinely enjoyed my company, not because she was positioning herself for financial advantage. As we talked about her visit and our plans for working together on Murphy Construction's future growth, I realized that the betrayal that had initially seemed so devastating had actually cleared the way for authentic relationships based on genuine love and mutual respect. The heart that had been broken by Hunter and Sarah's abandonment had healed, stronger than before, protected by wisdom earned through surviving the worst kind of family betrayal and emerging with a clearer understanding of what real loyalty and love actually look like in practice. Ruby Murphy had learned that sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in the most painful experiences, and that survival often requires the courage to let go of relationships that no longer serve your highest good, even when those relationships involve people you have loved with all your heart. The $1 million insurance policy that would now benefit people who had actually earned my trust through their actions rather than their promises represented not just financial planning, but a testament to the transformative power of learning to distinguish between genuine family bonds and sophisticated manipulation designed to exploit your deepest vulnerabilities. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Brookside Heights, I felt profound peace in knowing that Ruby Murphy's legacy would be built on authentic relationships, ethical business practices, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to rebuild with stronger foundations than before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.